The giant view screen in the Galactic Council chamber displayed the small blue-green planet. Most of the aliens watching had never seen Earth before. Some had heard stories about the primitive species that lived there, but few believed humans would ever join the greater galactic community. Jack Miller stood alone at the center of the massive circular chamber. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and dark hair, he looked impressive by human standards. But here, surrounded by delegates from over 200 alien species, he seemed small and fragile. This was the first time a human had ever addressed the Galactic Council. "Members of the Council," Jack began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I come from Earth to request that humanity be granted trading rights with the galactic community." A low murmur spread through the chamber. Trading rights were normally reserved for species with at least level 3 technology. Earth barely qualified as level 2. From his elevated seat, Elder Drax of the Vextari rose to his full height of nearly 9 feet. His gray-blue skin glistened under the chamber lights, and the elaborate crown on his head marked him as not just an elder, but the head of one of the most powerful families in the galaxy. "The human speaks of trade," Elder Drax said, his translator making his deep, rumbling voice understandable to all present. "But what does Earth have that the galaxy could possibly want?" Jack had prepared for this question. "We offer unique biological compounds found nowhere else in the known galaxy. Our planet's biodiversity. Samples of your planet's life forms can be collected without your permission." Drax interrupted with a dismissive wave of his 6-fingered hand. "Try again, human." Jack felt his face grow hot, but he maintained his composure. "We also offer human creativity. Our art, music, literature." The chamber erupted in laughter. Elder Drax's booming laugh rose above the others. "The primitive thinks we want its finger paintings," Drax mocked. "Perhaps next it will offer us its primitive weapons as well?" Jack clenched his fists. He had not expected to be ridiculed. The briefings from the few friendly aliens who had secretly contacted Earth hadn't prepared him for this level of disdain. "We may be young compared to your civilizations," Jack said firmly, "but humans adapt quickly. We learn. We grow. You die quickly too," Elder Drax replied coldly. "Your kind barely lives a century. How can such short-lived creatures ever contribute meaningfully to galactic society?" Before Jack could respond, the doors at the back of the chamber slid open. All heads turned as a female Vextari entered. She was taller than most females of her species, with the same gray-blue skin as Elder Drax but with iridescent patterns that shimmered as she moved. Her eyes were a striking silver, and she carried herself with unmistakable grace. "Father," she addressed Elder Drax, "I apologize for interrupting, but I believe you are making a mistake." Elder Drax's face darkened with anger. "Lyra! You were not invited to this session. Leave immediately." Lyra stood her ground. "I've studied Earth extensively. Humans have potential that you're dismissing too quickly." Jack stared at Lyra with surprise. He had no idea there were aliens who had studied Earth positively. "The human species is barely out of its caves," Elder Drax scoffed. "They still fight wars over resources and beliefs. And yet they've developed faster than any species we've encountered," Lyra countered. "From first flight to space travel in less than a century. Their rate of technological development is unprecedented." Elder Drax glared at his daughter, then at Jack. His eyes narrowed with sudden calculation. "Very well," he said after a moment. "If humans are so special, let's put them to the test." He pointed a long finger at Jack. "Human, I propose a challenge. If you succeed, Earth will be granted limited trading rights. If you fail, your planet will be placed under quarantine for the next 1,000 years." The chamber went silent. "What kind of challenge?" Jack asked cautiously. Elder Drax smiled, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "The trial of 7 paths. No off-worlder has ever completed it." Lyra gasped. "Father, that's fair," Elder Drax cut her off. "If humans are as exceptional as my daughter claims, surely one can pass a simple trial." Jack knew he should consult with Earth before accepting, but he also knew this might be humanity's only chance. The hidden alien allies who had helped humanity prepare for this meeting had warned that many in the Council wanted Earth isolated permanently. "I accept," Jack said firmly, ignoring the whispers that erupted around him. Elder Drax's smile widened. "Excellent. And to make things more interesting, if you somehow succeed, you may claim a prize of great value." His eyes flicked briefly toward Lyra. "Perhaps even a marriage alliance with the House of Drax." Lyra's silver eyes widened in shock. "Father!" But Elder Drax had already risen from his seat. "The trial begins tomorrow at first light. Prepare yourself, human. You'll need more than your species' famous luck to survive what awaits you." Jack stood at the entrance of an enormous dome-shaped structure. This was where the trial of 7 paths would take place. The rising sun of the alien world cast long shadows across the landscape, making the dome look even more ominous. "You shouldn't have accepted," said a voice behind him. Jack turned to see Lyra approaching. In the morning light, her skin had a pearlescent quality that made her look almost magical. "I didn't have much choice," Jack replied. "Your father made sure of that." Lyra stood beside him, nearly 2 feet taller than Jack. "The trial of 7 paths was designed for Vextari warriors. No human has ever attempted it." "So what exactly am I facing?" Jack asked. 7 challenges that test different abilities: strength, speed, intelligence, endurance, adaptability, courage, and something we call spirit perception, the ability to connect with the energy that flows through all living things. Jack frowned. "That last one sounds problematic. Most aliens who attempt the trial fail at that stage," Lyra admitted. "But I think humans might have an advantage there. Your species feels emotions more intensely than most." Before Jack could ask more questions, a loud horn sounded. The massive doors of the dome slid open. "Good luck, human," Lyra said softly. "I'll be watching." Jack took a deep breath and stepped inside. The doors closed behind him with a heavy thud. The first chamber was a simple circular room with stone walls. Elder Drax's voice boomed from hidden speakers. "The trial begins with the path of strength. Move the stone to reveal the passage forward." Jack looked around and spotted a massive round stone against one wall. It was at least twice his height, and appeared to weigh several tons. No human could possibly move it. "This is impossible," Jack muttered. He walked to the stone and pushed against it. As expected, it didn't budge. He circled it, looking for a trick, a lever, anything that might help. In the observation room, Elder Drax chuckled as he watched Jack struggle. "The human will give up soon. They always do when faced with impossible odds." Lyra said nothing, her silver eyes focused intently on the screen. Back in the chamber, Jack was getting frustrated. He had pushed, pulled, and tried to roll the stone, all without success. Then he noticed something, slight grooves in the floor around the stone. "It's not about moving the whole stone," he realized aloud. "It's about moving it correctly." Jack positioned himself at one specific point and pushed. The stone shifted slightly, revealing that it wasn't solid but consisted of interlocking segments. When pushed from the right angle, the segments slid against each other like a puzzle. Slowly, methodically, Jack worked out the pattern. Each move revealed more of the puzzle's solution. After 20 minutes of careful manipulation, the stone segments rearranged themselves into an arch, revealing a passage forward. In the observation room, Elder Drax's smug smile faded. "Impossible. Humans are excellent problem solvers," Lyra commented. "They look for solutions rather than brute-forcing challenges." Jack entered the second chamber, where Elder Drax's voice announced, "The path of speed. Cross the chamber before the floor disappears." This room was longer, with a floor made of what looked like glass panels. As soon as Jack stepped onto the first panel, it began to glow red. "I'm guessing that's not good," he muttered, then broke into a run as the panel behind him fell away into darkness. Each panel he stepped on began the same process, glowing red, then falling away. Jack ran faster, his military training paying off as he maintained his pace. The panels were disappearing faster now, forcing him to sprint at full speed. Near the end of the chamber, Jack's foot slipped on the edge of a panel. He stumbled, nearly falling into the abyss below. With a desperate lunge, he threw himself forward, grabbing the edge of the final platform. His legs dangled over nothingness as he pulled himself up, breathing hard. "That was too close," he gasped, lying on the solid platform for a moment before standing up. In the observation room, murmurs of surprise rippled through the gathered aliens. No one had expected the human to pass 2 trials so quickly. "Luck," Elder Drax sneered. "The next chamber will finish him." Lyra's expression remained carefully neutral, but there was a glimmer of hope in her silver eyes. Jack entered the 3rd chamber, steeling himself for whatever challenge came next. The path of intelligence awaited him, a vast room filled with floating symbols and complex holographic puzzles that shifted and changed as he watched them. "Solve the equation to proceed," Elder Drax's voice commanded. "You have 10 minutes. As Jack studied the bewildering array of alien mathematics before him, he couldn't help but smile grimly. This was exactly the kind of underestimation of humans that might just give him a chance. Back on Earth, before being selected for this mission, Jack had been a theoretical physicist specializing in quantum mechanics. The alien mathematics were different, but the principles were surprisingly familiar. Jack's fingers traced patterns in the air as the holographic symbols rearranged themselves at his touch. The alien mathematics used a base 16 system rather than Earth's base 10, but the underlying principles were similar to quantum equations he had worked with for years. 6 minutes remaining, announced Elder Drax's voice, carrying a hint of satisfaction. In the observation room, the gathered aliens watched with growing interest. No off-worlder had ever solved the intelligence trial in the allotted time. "The human appears to understand the basic framework," commented one council member. "But there's no way he can complete the full sequence in time." Elder Drax nodded confidently. "Even our brightest take hours to solve such equations." Lyra said nothing, but her posture had changed. She leaned forward, eyes fixed on Jack's methodical movements. Back in the chamber, Jack had identified the pattern. The equation wasn't just mathematical, it represented a multidimensional space-time problem. Rather than solving each part sequentially as the Vextari would expect, Jack worked on the core principle. 2 minutes remaining, Drax's voice warned. Jack ignored the countdown, focusing entirely on the central paradox of the equation. If he could solve that, the rest would fall into place. His hands moved faster now, rearranging symbols, canceling out variables, finding the elegant solution hidden within the complexity. 1 minute remaining. With a final gesture, Jack connected the last pieces of the equation. The holographic display pulsed with blue light, then stabilized into a single coherent pattern, the solution. "Time's up," Drax announced, just as the system registered Jack's correct answer. A stunned silence filled the observation room. "That's impossible," whispered an elder from another species. "He solved it with a completely different approach than our methods." Lyra couldn't hide her smile. "Humans think laterally. They find connections we might miss." Elder Drax's face darkened with anger. 3 trials mean nothing. No one has ever completed all 7. Jack entered the 4th chamber, catching his breath. The path of endurance stretched before him, a long, narrow bridge over what appeared to be a pit of boiling liquid. The air was thick with toxic fumes that made his eyes water and his lungs burn. "Cross the bridge," came Drax's instruction. Simple enough, even for a human. Jack pulled his shirt collar over his nose and mouth, but it provided little protection. The fumes were already making him dizzy. He took a tentative step onto the bridge, which swayed alarmingly under his weight. "The structural integrity of the bridge deteriorates with time," Drax added. "So I suggest you hurry." Each step was agony as the toxic air burned Jack's lungs. Halfway across, his vision began to blur. The bridge was deteriorating faster now, sections beginning to dissolve behind him. Jack staggered forward, each breath more painful than the last. His human physiology wasn't designed for this atmosphere. Black spots danced in his vision as oxygen deprivation set in. 3/4 across, he stumbled and fell to his knees. The bridge trembled beneath him, sections crumbling away. In the observation room, many aliens turned away, unable to watch what seemed like certain death. His species lacks the respiratory adaptations needed for our atmosphere at full toxicity, one scientist noted. He should already be unconscious. Elder Drax watched with cold satisfaction. So falls the human's arrogance. But Lyra saw something different. Look at his eyes, she said. He's not giving up. On the bridge, Jack pulled himself forward on hands and knees. His lungs felt like they were filled with fire, his muscles screaming with pain. But in his mind, he could hear the mocking laughter of Elder Drax, could see the fate of Earth hanging in the balance. With one final, desperate surge of strength, Jack lunged forward and rolled onto the platform at the end of the bridge, just as the last section collapsed behind him. He lay there gasping, each breath torture as his body fought to expel the toxic fumes. The chamber doors opened, allowing fresh air to flow in. Slowly, painfully, Jack pulled himself to his feet. His clothes were singed, his skin reddened from chemical burns, but he was alive. In the observation room, shocked whispers spread among the aliens. "4 trials," Lyra said quietly. "No off-worlder has ever passed 4 trials." Elder Drax's expression was unreadable now. "The 5th trial will be different. The path of adaptability has no solution, it changes based on the participants' weaknesses." "What does that mean?" asked another council member. "It means," Elder Drax replied, "that the human will face his greatest fears. And I've studied their species enough to know they have many." Jack limped into the 5th chamber, still struggling to breathe normally. The room appeared empty, just smooth white walls and floor. Then the door sealed behind him, and the chamber began to transform. The white walls around Jack rippled like water, then transformed into a familiar scene, the small apartment where he had grown up on Earth. But something was wrong. Water was pouring in through the windows, rising rapidly around his ankles. "The path of adaptability tests your ability to overcome your deepest fears," Elder Drax's voice echoed. "Our scans indicate you nearly drowned as a child. Let's see how you handle it now." The water was already up to Jack's knees and rising fast. He tried the door, but it was sealed shut. The windows had become solid walls. There was no escape. In the observation room, Elder Drax smiled coldly. "Humans have a particular terror of drowning. Their primitive brains retain the fear even after they've evolved beyond it." Lyra watched the screens with concern. "You're enjoying this too much, Father." "I'm simply ensuring the human faces a proper challenge," Drax replied. "One he cannot outsmart." The water had reached Jack's chest now. Panic flared in his mind, the same blind terror he'd felt as a 7-year-old child when he'd fallen through ice on a frozen lake. But this time, he forced himself to think clearly. "This isn't real," Jack reasoned aloud. "It's a simulation designed to trigger my fear response." The water reached his neck. Jack took a deep breath as his head went under. The room was nearly filled now, with just a small pocket of air at the ceiling. Jack swam to it and took another breath. "Adaptability," he thought. "That's the key. Not fighting the fear, but adapting to it." Instead of struggling against the water, Jack fully submerged himself. If he couldn't escape the water, he would have to adapt to it. He focused on slowing his heart rate, conserving oxygen, becoming one with the environment trying to kill him. In the observation room, confusion spread among the watchers. "What is he doing?" one alien asked. "Why isn't he fighting? His vital signs are stabilizing," another noted with surprise. "He's actually calming down." Elder Drax frowned. "Impossible. The fear response should be overwhelming him." Underwater, Jack had entered a state of perfect calm. His lungs burned for air, but he quieted his mind, focusing only on the present moment. And as he did, something strange happened. The water began to feel different, less threatening, almost comfortable. With sudden insight, Jack realized the true nature of the test. It wasn't about overcoming fear through struggle, but through acceptance and adaptation. He stopped seeing the water as an enemy and started seeing it as simply another environment. As this realization settled in his mind, Jack felt a strange tingling across his skin. Looking down at his hands, he saw a faint webbing starting to form between his fingers. His neck tickled as small slits opened just below his jawline, rudimentary gills. In the observation room, the aliens watched in astonishment. "His body is adapting on a cellular level," gasped one scientist. "But humans don't have that capability." "Apparently they do, under the right circumstances," Lyra said, unable to hide her amazement. "Their DNA must be more flexible than we thought." Elder Drax stood speechless, his plans unraveling before his eyes. Jack swam freely now, breathing through his newly formed gills, moving with a grace that felt natural and right. The water that had been his greatest fear had become his element. The chamber detected his successful adaptation and the water level began to recede. As the last of the water drained away, Jack stood in the center of the chamber, dripping wet but breathing normally. The temporary adaptations were already fading, the webbing between his fingers disappearing, the gill slits closing. The door to the sixth chamber opened. 5 trials, Elder Drax's voice announced, all smugness gone now. "You face the path of courage next, human. Few have ever passed it." Jack stepped through the doorway, his newfound confidence evident in his stride. The sixth chamber was dark, lit only by faint blue lights around the perimeter. In the center stood a pedestal with what appeared to be a helmet resting on it. "To pass the path of courage," Elder Drax explained, "you must face your worst memories and your darkest thoughts. The helmet will connect directly to your mind. There is no strategy here, no clever solution. Only the courage to face yourself." Jack approached the pedestal slowly. This would be different from the other trials. This would be personal. In the observation room, Elder Drax had recovered some of his composure. "The mind probe has broken even our strongest warriors. A fragile human mind will shatter under its influence." Lyra wasn't so sure. "Humans feel emotions more intensely than we do, Father. That includes courage." Jack lifted the helmet and studied it for a moment. Then, without hesitation, he placed it on his head. Immediately, his body went rigid as the helmet activated. On the observation screens, his vital signs spiked dangerously. The trial had begun. Inside the helmet, Jack found himself standing on a battlefield. All around him lay the bodies of fallen soldiers, his former teammates from the war that had ravaged Earth before first contact with alien life. The sky burned red above him, and the acrid smell of smoke filled his nostrils. "This isn't real," Jack whispered to himself, though it felt more real than any memory had a right to. "Isn't it?" asked a voice behind him. Jack turned to see Captain Reed, his former commanding officer, a man who had died in Jack's arms after a surprise attack. "You left us to die, Lieutenant Miller." "That's not true," Jack said, his voice shaking. "I did everything I could." Other figures rose from the battlefield, friends and comrades he had lost, each accusing him of failure, of survival when they had perished. Their voices merged into a chorus of blame that threatened to overwhelm him. In the observation room, Jack's vital signs were reaching dangerous levels. "His heart rate and stress hormones are spiking beyond safe limits," one alien technician reported. Elder Drax nodded with satisfaction. "The human mind is fragile. It cannot bear the weight of its own guilt." Lyra watched Jack's face on the screen, contorted in pain yet somehow still determined. "You underestimate them, Father. Humans carry their pain differently than we do." On the battlefield of Jack's mind, the accusations grew louder, more vicious. The simulation was drawing from his deepest fears and regrets, amplifying them to unbearable levels. "You think you deserve to represent Earth?" Captain Reed's ghost demanded. "You couldn't even save your own team. What makes you think you can save your planet?" Jack fell to his knees, the weight of guilt threatening to crush him. For a moment, he considered surrender, removing the helmet and accepting defeat. It would be so easy to give in. Then something shifted in Jack's mind. A memory surfaced, not of failure, but of what came after. The rebuilding efforts he had led, the survivors he had helped, the purpose he had found in ensuring that the sacrifices of his friends were not in vain. "You're right," Jack said to the ghosts surrounding him. "I couldn't save everyone. I carry that failure every day." He rose to his feet, standing tall among the accusing spirits. "But that's what it means to be human," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "We fail. We feel guilt. We grieve. And then we keep going, because that's all we can do." One by one, Jack addressed each ghost, acknowledging his failures but refusing to be defined by them. As he did, the spirits began to fade, their accusations losing power. "I don't deserve to represent Earth because I'm perfect," Jack declared to the empty battlefield. "I deserve it because I'm human, flawed, scarred, and still fighting." In the observation room, the aliens watched in astonishment as Jack's vital signs stabilized, then strengthened. "He's accepting the guilt rather than fighting it," one scientist noted with wonder. "I've never seen that response before. It's as if the more the simulation attacks his psyche, the stronger his resolve becomes," another added. Elder Drax's frown deepened. "Increase the intensity. Push him beyond his limits." "Father," Lyra protested, "that could cause permanent psychological damage." "The trial has rules," Drax snapped. "I'm merely following them." Inside the simulation, the battlefield transformed. Now Jack found himself facing not just his past, but potential futures, visions of Earth under quarantine, humanity slowly dying in isolation, all because he had failed this trial. But instead of breaking him, these visions only strengthened Jack's resolve. He recognized them for what they were: manipulations designed to trigger despair. "Nice try," Jack said aloud. "But if there's one thing humans are good at, it's hoping against hope." The visions shattered like glass, and Jack removed the helmet. He stood in the chamber, sweating and shaking but unbowed. The door to the seventh and final chamber opened before him. "6 trials," Elder Drax's voice announced, now tight with barely controlled anger. "But the 7th will be your undoing, human. The path of spirit perception cannot be overcome by determination alone." Jack took a moment to catch his breath. His body ached from the previous trials, and his mind felt raw from the psychological assault of the 6th. But he had come too far to falter now. He stepped into the 7th chamber, a simple circular room with a dirt floor. In the center grew a single plant with luminescent blue leaves that pulsed with gentle light. "To pass the final trial," Elder Drax explained, "you must connect with the spirit of the Crixtop plant. It reads the energy of all living things and responds only to those it deems worthy. No off-worlder has ever successfully communicated with it." Jack approached the plant slowly. It seemed to retreat slightly, its leaves curling inward as he drew near. "There is no time limit for this trial," Elder Drax added, a hint of mockery returning to his voice. "Take as long as you need to admit defeat." Jack stood before the Crixtop plant, its luminescent blue leaves pulsing with a gentle rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat. He knelt down, studying it without touching, respecting its space. In the observation room, the gathered aliens watched with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. No one truly expected the human to pass this final test. "Even our young take years to learn spirit perception," an elder scientist commented. "The human has no chance." Elder Drax nodded confidently. "The Crixta responds only to those who can project pure emotional energy. Humans are too chaotic, too conflicted in their feelings." Lyra said nothing, but her eyes never left the screen showing Jack's face, calm now, focused with an intensity that seemed almost meditative. Jack reached out slowly toward the plant, not quite touching it. The Crixta's leaves curled tighter, retreating from his presence. He pulled his hand back, considering. "I can feel it," he said softly. "It's afraid. The plant senses your alien nature," Elder Drax's voice announced with smug satisfaction. "It rejects you, as it has rejected all off-worlders before you." Jack shook his head. "No, It's not about me being human. It's about intent. You've used this plant as a test, a tool. It doesn't trust because it's never been given a reason to. He sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, a respectful distance from the Krixta. Then he did something unexpected. He began to speak to it, not with words the observers could hear, but in a low, gentle murmur. "What is he doing?" one council member asked. "Talking to a plant," another replied with a dismissive laugh. "Primitive Earth behavior." But Lyra noticed something they missed. "Look at his hands," she said quietly. Jack had placed his palms on the ground, fingers spread and touching the soil near, but not touching, the Krixta's roots. And as he spoke, his expression changed to one of profound openness, a vulnerability no one had expected. Hours passed. Jack remained in the same position, sometimes speaking softly, sometimes silent, always maintaining the same open, receptive posture. The Krixta's leaves remained tightly curled. "This is absurd," Elder Drax finally declared. "The human has clearly failed. I call an end to the trial. The rules state the participant may take as long as needed," Lyra reminded him. "Those were your words, Father." "Fine. Let him waste more time," Drax snapped. "The result will be the same." As the second day of the final trial began, observers started to drift away, certain of the outcome. Only Lyra remained constantly vigilant, watching as Jack continued his patient communication with the plant. "He hasn't eaten or slept," she noted with concern. "Human stubbornness," her father replied. "Nothing more." Late in the second day, something changed. Jack had fallen silent for several hours, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and regular. He appeared to be in a trance-like state, completely still except for his steady breathing. The Krixta's leaves began to uncurl, ever so slightly. Lyra leaned forward. "Father, look!" As they watched, the plant's luminescence intensified. Its leaves unfurled completely, then began to bend toward Jack, reaching for him though he hadn't moved. "Impossible," Elder Drax whispered. The Krixta's central stem elongated, stretching until its topmost leaves brushed against Jack's forehead. At the contact, Jack's eyes opened, and they glowed with the same blue luminescence as the plant. In the chamber, Jack experienced something beyond words. The Krixta wasn't just communicating, it was sharing its perception of reality. Through its touch, Jack sensed the interconnectedness of all living things, the flowing energy that bound the universe together. It was overwhelming yet profoundly peaceful. "Thank you," Jack whispered to the plant as their connection slowly faded. The Krixta retreated to its normal shape, but its leaves remained open, facing Jack like a friend. The chamber doors slid open. The seventh trial was complete. Jack stood on shaky legs and walked out to find the entire council waiting. Their expressions ranged from shock to disbelief to, in a few cases, something close to awe. Elder Drax stood at the front, his face an unreadable mask. "7 trials," Jack said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "As we agreed, Earth will now be granted trading rights with the galactic community." There was a moment of tense silence before the council leader stepped forward. "The agreement will be honored. Earth is officially recognized as a trading partner, with all the protections that status provides." A murmur of approval ran through the council members. Many approached Jack, eager to speak with the first off-worlder to complete the trial of 7 paths. Lyra made her way to Jack's side. "You understood, didn't you? That the Krixta wasn't testing your ability to project emotion, but to receive it?" Jack nodded. "It didn't want to be convinced or commanded. It wanted to be heard. Something my father never understood," Lyra said, glancing at Elder Drax, who stood apart from the celebration, his posture rigid with displeasure. "Speaking of your father," Jack said, "there was another part to our agreement." A hush fell over the gathered aliens as Jack approached Elder Drax. "I have fulfilled my part of the bargain," Jack said formally. "I claimed the prize you offered, a marriage alliance with the House of Drax." Elder Drax's face darkened. "You cannot possibly expect—" "Father," Lyra interrupted, stepping forward. "You made the offer before the council. Your honor is bound to it. For a long moment, Elder Drax seemed ready to explode with rage. Then, to everyone's surprise, he laughed, a genuine sound of amusement rather than mockery. Well played, human, he said, shaking his head. I underestimated your species at every turn. Perhaps there is something to learn from Earth after all. He looked between Jack and Lyra, seeing the way they stood together. The alliance is granted, Elder Drax announced. Though I suspect this outcome was not entirely unexpected by all parties involved. Lyra smiled, taking Jack's hand in hers. Humans aren't the only ones who can adapt to new possibilities, Father. As news of the humans' triumph and the unprecedented alliance spread throughout the galaxy, the status of Earth changed overnight. No longer dismissed as a primitive backwater, it became known as the home of the species that completed the impossible trials, and in doing so, changed the course of galactic history. Jack Miller, once mocked by Elder Drax, had won more than just trading rights for Earth. He had won respect for humanity and, in Lyra, found a partner who saw the true strength in what others had dismissed as human weakness. Together, they would bridge two worlds that had never before understood each other.